1991, two crime reporters in Austria were chasing the same story. Women were disappearing from the red light districts of Graz and Vienna. Not one or two, enough that the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The first reporter was a working newspaperman in Graz named Hans Breitiger. He kept a list. He noticed that the list kept growing. The second reporter was the most famous writer in the country. He had access nobody else had. He could walk into any red light district at 2 in the morning and get people to talk to him. He got the interviews. He got the police to sit down with him on the record. He was better at the story than anyone. He should have been. He was the one making it happen. If cases like this are your kind of thing, hit subscribe before we go further. Because the strangest part of this story is not what he did, it's who was standing next to him while he did it, and how many of them were good people. His name was Johann Unterweger. Everyone called him Jack. He was born on the 16th of August 1950 in Judenberg, a small town in Styria, Austria. His mother was Austrian. His father was an American soldier posted to Europe after the war. Jack never knew him. His mother did not stay either. She had her own trouble with the law, and the boy was handed to his grandfather. So he grew up in the Corinthian countryside, in a house with an old man and not much else. No father. A mother who came and went. A childhood best described by what was missing from it. By his teens, he was already in the system. Petty crime first, then more. By his early 20s, Jack Unterweger was the sort of young man the Austrian courts had stopped expecting anything from. And in 1974, he took the life of an 18-year-old woman named Margaret Schaefer. He was convicted in 1976. Life sentence. At his sentencing, he said one sentence that would follow him for the next 20 years. He said he had pictured his mother in front of him. 20 years later, that sentence would be sitting in the middle of a psychiatric report, and it would help convict him a second time. But nobody knew that yet. What happened inside the prison is the part that makes this story genuinely difficult. Because it was real. Unterweger went in barely literate. He taught himself to read properly. Then he taught himself to write. Then he did not stop. He wrote poems. He wrote short stories. He wrote stage plays. He wrote books for children. And in the early 1980s, he wrote an account of his own crime and his own imprisonment, published in German under the title Fegefeuer, Purgatory. It became a bestseller, not a novelty, not a curiosity item, a genuine national bestseller that was taken seriously by serious people, and was later adapted into a feature film. He won literary prizes for his writing. His work was staged. His book was filmed. The Austrian literary world did not just admire him, it adopted him. Here, they thought, was the argument made flesh. A man born with nothing, who had done something terrible, and who had built himself back out of language. If prison could produce this, then prison could produce anything. So a campaign started. And it was not a fringe campaign. It was writers, intellectuals, editors, public figures. Respectable people doing what they honestly believed was the decent thing. Free the writer. On the 23rd of May 1990, they did. 15 years of a life sentence. That was all he served. A prison official was quoted at the time saying they would never find a prisoner better prepared for freedom than this one. Remember that line. It is going to get worse every time you think about it. What happened next moved faster than anybody expected. Unterweger did not slip quietly into a normal life. He detonated into celebrity. There was a press conference almost immediately. Then the talk shows. He turned up on Austrian national television in a white silk suit. Red flower on the lapel, gold on his fingers, and he was funny. He was self-aware. He was completely disarming. He talked about prison reform. He talked about the stigma that follows people with criminal records for the rest of their lives. He argued that men like him could come back. The ratings were excellent, and then Austria's media did the thing that turns this from a story about one criminal into a story about a whole country. They gave him a job. It made sense at the time. That is the uncomfortable part. Who understands crime better than a man who has lived inside it? Who gets a frightened woman on a street corner to open up at 2 in the morning? A reporter in a good coat? Or someone the street recognizes as one of its own? So Jack Unterweger became a crime journalist for some of the biggest outlets in the country. 4 months after his release, in September 1990, a woman named Blanka Bochkova was killed in Prague. Then Austria started losing women. Brunhilde Masser, Heidi Hammerer, Elfriede Schrempf, Sylvia Zagler, Sabine Moitzi, Regina Prem, Karin Eroglu. 7, in roughly a year. Most were found later in wooded areas outside the cities. Some were not found for months. And here I want to slow down for one moment, because the Austrian press of 1991 did not. Every one of these women was a sex worker, which meant that in the newspapers they stopped being individuals and became a category. They were described by how they earned money, and almost never by anything else. Several of them were mothers. One of them, Regina Prem, had a husband who looked for her for years and never gave up. That framing was not a side detail. It was the reason this took as long as it did. A missing woman with a middle-class address is a manhunt. A missing woman from the red light district was, in 1991, a filing category. Somebody chose those victims on purpose. He knew exactly how the story would be covered. He knew because he was one of the people covering it. An Austrian evening radio program gave Jack Unterweger the assignment to report on the very disappearances he was causing, and he was good at it. He went out to the districts. He interviewed the women still working there. He asked them whether they were frightened, and he wrote up what they told him. He published essays about the killings in Austrian newspapers, and then he arranged a sit-down interview with senior Vienna police and asked them, on the record, how the investigation was going. He asked the police what they had. They told him. He broadcast it to the country under his own byline. There is no evidence that a single person in that room suspected anything. Why would they? He was a celebrated author. He had been vetted by half the literary establishment of Austria. He was, officially, the nation's proudest success story. But two people were starting to feel uneasy. One was Hans Breitiger, the Graz newspaperman. He was not a famous man. He had no national platform and no white suit. He was a local crime reporter doing the least glamorous job in journalism, keeping track of things that had not been officially connected yet. He watched the disappearances in his own city stack up, and he did not like the shape of them. There is something worth sitting with there. The country's most celebrated crime writer was reporting on these cases from the inside, and the man who actually started pulling the thread was an ordinary newspaperman in a regional city, working from a list he kept himself. The other was inside the police, where somebody eventually noticed something obvious. The new killings looked like the old one, the 1974 case that Unterweger had already served 15 years for. So in 1991, the police brought him in and interviewed him. He did not panic. He did not deny being in the red light district. That would have been stupid, and he was not stupid. He told them he was there constantly. He said he was interviewing sex workers, for research, for his articles, and every word of that was true, and completely verifiable, and it explained everything. They had nothing. They let him go, and then an Austrian magazine handed him the perfect exit. They sent him to Los Angeles. The assignment was ordinary journalism. Compare the red light districts of Austria and the United States. Look at how the two countries treat the women working in them. File the piece. He checked into the Cecil Hotel at 643 South Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. If that name means something to you, it is for entirely separate reasons and an entirely different decade. And then he did the thing that investigators still wince about. He contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. He introduced himself as a European journalist researching a story on street crime. He asked for access. They gave it to him. He rode along in patrol cars. He toured the districts with officers who had no idea who was sitting next to them. He collected their business cards and kept them. He was in the city about 5 weeks. In those 5 weeks, 3 women were killed in Los Angeles. Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, and a third woman whose name appears differently across different accounts, which tells you something about how carefully these deaths were recorded at the time. 2 of them were last seen close to the hotel where he was staying. All 3 cases went cold. Los Angeles in 1991 had a homicide caseload that is difficult to describe to anyone who did not live through it. 3 deaths, spread over weeks, among women the system had already written off. Nobody joined those dots to each other. Certainly not to a visiting Austrian writer with lapped business cards in his pocket. Then the killings stopped, as suddenly as they had started. Because he had gone home, he filed his article, and what finally caught Jack Unterweger was not a witness. It was not a confession. He never gave one. It was a knot. By late 1991, the Austrian investigation had stalled badly, and the reason was almost embarrassing. Austrian police had never worked a case like this, not once. They had no framework for a killer who crossed borders, changed cities, and left almost nothing behind. So they did something they had never done. They went through the United States Embassy in Vienna and asked the FBI for help. They were connected to a special agent named Greg McCrary, from what was then the Behavioral Science Unit. McCrary did not look for a motive. He looked for repetition. And he found it in a detail that meant nothing to a layman and everything to a forensic examiner. Across the cases, the victim's own clothing had been tied in a very specific, intricate way. Not a common method. Not the sort of thing two different people arrive at independently. It was a signature, as individual as handwriting. McCrary's conclusion was blunt. One offender, all of them. Then he asked the question that broke the case open. He picked up a phone to Los Angeles and asked whether the Lapt had any unsolved killings of women carrying that same signature. Detective Fred Miller called back. Los Angeles had 3. Somebody pulled the dates. The 3 Los Angeles deaths fell inside the exact window Jack Unterweger had spent in the city on a magazine assignment. Then investigators went at his life with a fine comb, and they found the most boring evidence imaginable, which is usually the best kind. Receipts, restaurant receipts, travel records, paperwork he had kept without thinking about it. Ordinary documents that placed him in each location on the nights that mattered. They found maps of Los Angeles in his apartment, and they found the business cards of the Lapt officers who had driven him around. Then came Prague, and the first piece of physical evidence in the entire case. Through Interpol, the Austrians connected the 1990 death of Blanka Bočková. Unterweger's car from that period had broken down and been sold off for parts. Investigators traced the vehicle to a garage in Linz, went over the seat, and recovered a hair belonging to Bočková. That was it. One hair. After more than a year of nothing. A warrant was issued, and an Austrian tactical unit went into his Vienna apartment. He was already gone. He had left the country with a girlfriend named Bianca Mamrak. She was 18 years old. She had met him after his release, when he was the most admired writer in Austria, and she had no reason on earth to think he was anything else. They crossed into the United States together. So now the situation was this. An Austrian celebrity author was loose somewhere inside a country of 250 million people. He was traveling with a teenager who believed he was innocent. Behind him, Austrian police were attempting their first serial investigation, while American agencies tried to match a signature across 3 jurisdictions. And by then, Unterweger had understood exactly what was happening. So he did the one thing only he could do. He fought back through the press. He was a media celebrity and a working journalist with contacts at every major outlet in Austria. He used all of them. He gave interviews. He told the country he was being persecuted by police who could not tolerate the idea of a reformed convict succeeding in public life. He suggested they wanted him back inside to prove their own worldview correct, and a large part of the Austrian public believed him. Think about the box that put investigators in. Every move against him could be spun by him, in real time, into proof of the persecution he was describing. He was arrested in Miami, Florida, on the 27th of February 1992, and extradited to Austria. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the man. Being charged did not shut him up. It gave him a bigger stage. The indictments piled up and his public support did not collapse with them. He kept giving interviews from custody. He kept talking to reporters who had once been his colleagues. And he used those interviews to boast about how he was going to win. Not to protest his innocence quietly. To predict his victory, publicly, in advance. He spent 2 years telling Austria he would walk out of that courtroom. Then the courtroom opened. His trial began in Graz in 1994, and one writer later called it the trial of the century in Austria. He was charged with 11 counts, and he did something almost nobody expected. He testified in his own defense. It was, by every account of people who were in that room, an extraordinary performance. He did not present himself as a good man. That would never have worked, and he knew it. Instead, he attacked his own character before the prosecution could. He told the jury he was a rat. He told them he was an inveterate liar. He described himself as a man who consumed women rather than loved them. It is a brilliant tactic, and you can see exactly why it works. A liar who admits he is a liar sounds, for a moment, like the most honest man in the building. People who were there genuinely feared he was going to walk. But the prosecution had spent 2 years building something he could not charm his way past. Lynn Harold from the Los Angeles Crime Lab testified about the knots, the signature that tied cities and countries together. Greg McCrary took the stand and walked the jury through the behavioral pattern, and then did the thing that must have been very hard to sit through. He connected the pattern in the new cases to Unterweger's original crime from 1974, the one he had already been convicted of, the one he had built a literary career out of describing. There was a psychiatric report describing his nature in terms the jury could not unhear. An Austrian psychiatrist, Dr. Reinhard Haller, assessed him that year and diagnosed a narcissistic personality disorder, a condition organized around the need to be seen a certain way, which meant the prosecution could finally explain the thing that had made no sense to anybody. Why a man with a best-selling book, a film deal, and a national television career would risk all of it. Because the fame was never the goal. It was the cover, and it was the audience, and it was part of the same appetite. There was Blanka Botchkova's hair from the car in Linz. There were red fibers recovered from Brunhilde Masser, consistent with a red scarf belonging to Unterweger. There were the receipts, placing him in each city on each night. And there were his own former girlfriends and associates, taking the stand one after another to describe how thoroughly he had deceived them. The prosecution's case was, by their own admission, largely circumstantial. Nobody pretended otherwise. Each individual piece could be argued with. Stacked together, they were impossible. The jury convicted him on 9 of the 11 counts. The Prague victim, all 3 in Los Angeles, 5 in Austria. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And that same night, in his cell in Graz, Jack Unterweger took his own life. Hours after the verdict, before he had served a single day of the sentence. Which brings us to the ending, and it is genuinely one of the strangest legal footnotes in modern European crime. Under Austrian law, a conviction does not become legally final until the appeals process has run its course. Unterweger's lawyers had already filed. He died before that process could begin, which means the verdict never became legally final. 9 counts, 4 countries, 2 years of international investigation. And at the last possible moment, he stepped out from underneath all of it. Some people read that as coincidence and nothing more. Others read it as one last decision. A man who spent his whole life managing how other people saw him, refusing to let a courtroom have the final word. Here is what stays with me, and it is not him. Jack Unterweger is, in the end, a fairly well-understood type. A man assessed as having a personality built around the need to be admired. He found the one route to admiration available to him, and rode it as far as it would go. Greg McCrary later summed him up in a line that is hard to improve on. Educate a psychopath, and all you get is an educated psychopath. What stays with me is everybody else. Nobody in this story was stupid. The writers who campaigned for his release believed in something decent, that people can change, that a prison ought to produce something better than what it took in. That belief is not wrong. Most of the time it is right, and a society that abandons it becomes something worse. The editors who hired him were not reckless. They saw a man with real insight into a world their other reporters could not enter. The Los Angeles officers who took him on a ride-along were extending ordinary professional courtesy to a foreign journalist doing his job. Every one of those decisions was defensible on the day it was made. That is what makes this case worth 2 hours of anybody's thinking. And the people who paid for all of it were the ones nobody was watching to begin with. That is not a coincidence in this story. It is the mechanism of it. He selected women whose disappearances would be filed rather than investigated, because he had spent a year reading exactly how those disappearances got written up. He understood the blind spot because he was standing inside it, holding a press pass. Blanka Botchkova was 28 years old. Sylvia Zagler was 23. Regina Prem's husband searched for her for years. Those names are the reason to tell this at all. If this one held you to the end, tell me in the comments where you think the real failure was. The parole board that believed him, the editors who hired him, or a press that had already decided which victims were worth a front page. I don't think there's a clean answer. I'd like to hear yours. There are more cases like this one waiting for you on the channel.